Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to episode 8 of Utopian Horizons, a podcast about utopias real and imaginary. This podcast is about Jeremy Corbyn, Corbynism, Corbynites, whatever other suffixes you might like to add to Corbyn's name. It's a bit different in terms of stuff I've been doing on the podcast. I tend to be picking stuff out from the past, whether that be cultural artifacts like books or movies or whatever, or people that are long gone. Now, obviously, while the influences of those things may continue to be felt, and they may certainly still be relevant to today, and I think that's something that would have come out in the episodes, I thought it would be interesting to do something that's ongoing in a more concrete way. Utopia is not just about the past or past imaginings, it's very much about today and how people are trying to make society better, how people are trying to change things. So I thought it would be interesting to look at a political movement that has some kind of utopian dimension and talk about that, hence the episode on Corbyn. I'm conscious as well that some people might question why I'm framing Jeremy Corbyn and the project that he's trying to undertake as Labour leader as a utopian one. When you think of utopia, you would tend to think of something more ambitious, more spectacular in terms of what it's trying to achieve. And when you compare what Labour is proposing to other utopian imaginings, then certainly it kind of pales in comparison. It's not necessarily that radical. I do see that. I'm not going to try and address that now because I think the reason you might call Corbynism utopian and the degree to which it has a utopian dimension is something that I hope will come out of the conversation that I have with Abi Wilkinson, who is the guest on this episode. Abi is a journalist who writes for a number of places like The Guardian. Pretty sure I've seen her on The Independent, a few other places as well. There were a lot of journalists who, in the lead up to the general election, essentially spent their time just mocking and dismissing Corbyn and the movement behind him, which, even if you're against Corbyn's politics, I think was a rather stupid thing to do because it left them rather ill-equipped to understand what was happening and to understand the new political context, and they're now struggling to respond to that. So that was a strategic error, which is very much welcome from my perspective on their part. Abi, probably because she, to some extent, shares Corbyn politics, was one of the few journalists who bothered to take Corbyn seriously and to analyse him and the movement behind him in a serious way. So that makes her a really good person to have on for this episode. Before we get on to the conversation with Abi, I'm going to leave all the Twitter and all that rubbish till the end, so don't worry about that. But I just really briefly want to say, if you have been listening to this podcast and enjoying it, or listened to this episode and enjoying it, if you could take a moment to give this a rating and review, or iTunes, whatever you use to listen to this, that would be massively appreciated. I've only got a few reviews on iTunes, and that doesn't reflect the amount of people that listen to this. I know there are a lot more people that listen to this than that. So just giving me a review, which would take a couple of minutes, would help me to grow this and make this bigger and better. So I know it's annoying that I keep asking you to do it every episode, but yeah, that's the one thing I'm going to ask today. If you could do that, that would be great. The one other thing I want to quite quickly address, I'm not really happy with the frequency that I've been getting episodes out. I mentioned that almost every time as well. Part of the reason for that is it's difficult. I mean, every episode takes a lot of time anyway, but one of the big things is trying to find guests and then trying to work out when we've both got free time and then arranging to do the interview and stuff. And sometimes things go wrong and we have to rearrange. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a kind of mini-series within Utopian Horizons, I suppose, on the novels of Philip K. Dick. And I'm going to be doing that by myself. So I don't have to worry about getting guests and I can just do that as and when. And that will hopefully help me to get some episodes out a bit more regularly. Now, I know Philip K. Dick pretty well, so I'm hoping it'll work, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes. It's something I'm going to try. If you can give me some feedback, if it's good, then I'll keep on doing it. If it doesn't work, then I'll just stop, whatever. I'm going to be trying to do it roughly chronologically, but it's also going to depend on novels that I've already got, basically. So the first one that I'm going to do, if you happen to want to read the novel before that episode comes out, will be Time Out of Joint. So yeah, that'll be coming soon, and then we'll just see how that goes, and hopefully it'll be something that keeps going and I can work my way through his bibliography. But anyway, enough of that. On to my conversation with Abi. So joining me now is journalist Abi Wilkinson. Abi has the distinction of being one of the few journalists who thought it might be worthwhile trying to understand what Corbyn represented and to take the movement behind him seriously before the election. So that makes her a rather good person to come on. Thank you very much for joining me, Abi.
Thank you for having me on.
The first thing I wanted to do, I don't want to patronise my audience. I'm sure they're all very smart and knowledgeable, but I do have quite a lot of listeners from overseas who might know who Corbyn is, but might not know the kind of intricacies behind his rise and how kind of bizarre it is. So for the benefit of those people, could you just explain a bit about who Corbyn is and how he came to power, what happened in the election and why that was a bit weird and unexpected?
Okay, so Jeremy Corbyn is a Labour MP and has been a Labour MP for a long time. He's always been on sort of the leftward side of his party, which has really not been in control of the party it wasn't in control of the party for several decades. It was sort of marginalised during the New Labour era. And there was a leadership election in 2015, and basically he ended up on the ballot because some people nominated him, some MPs nominated him because they supported him, but some nominated him on the basis that it would broaden the debate. And they thought it was like right to include a left-winger, but it wasn't really where they were coming from.
Kind of like a token thing.
Yeah.
For that side of the pie.
And then it turned out it was, the members are looking for change, and they had new people joining the party as well. And he won massively. He beat, there was another 4 candidates, I think. Was there 4? No, 3? Another 3 candidates.
I can't remember.
Yeah, I might be forgetting someone. 3, I think. But he won massively. So we've had this kind of funny situation where he's long had the support of like the members or the majority of the members, but not really the party establishment and not necessarily a lot of his MPs. So there was a rebellion in 2016 and most of his MPs voted no confidence in him. There was another leadership election, but then the members just voted for Corbyn again. So Labour was it seemed to be in this kind of fairly impossible situation, and it was polling really badly. And there's, I think a lot of voters thought it looked a bit of a mess, but then it sort of made a miraculous recovery during the there was a general election that Theresa May, the leader of the Conservatives, called because she thought that they couldn't lose it. Basically, she thought Labour looked so weak, and then when the election was called and Corbyn and Labour started campaigning, voters decided they kind of liked what they saw, and also didn't like what they were seeing from the Conservatives. So Labour didn't win the election, but it won a lot more votes than was expected. It was polling at maybe 23%, and then it ended up getting, after a few months later, 40% of the vote. So the Conservatives lost seats, Labour gained seats, and the Conservatives lost so many seats that they couldn't actually govern independently. They did have majority control of Parliament, and now they're propped up by this sort of quite odd Northern Irish, very religious Protestant party that is very anti-abortion, and they've had to make a deal with this party that they'll spend quite a lot of money. They'll give them quite a lot of money, basically, as a bribe, effectively, for Northern Ireland, which sort of undermines a lot of their arguments about their not being a magic money tree and not being able to afford things, because what it seems like is there's absolutely money to spend when it suits them. So they're in a bit of a mess at the moment, and Labour under Corbyn suddenly looks like a very viable force, and they're bookies' favourite to win the next election now. The polls currently has Labour a bit ahead, so it looks like if there was an election called tomorrow, Labour would win.
And this was obviously a big, like you said, even though they didn't technically win, this was still a big surprise. I think it was the biggest swing since 1945, I believe, in terms of votes. And this was the first time Labour had gained votes since 1997, and this was a big surprise. This went against what a lot of the media was saying would happen in the run-up to election, which has kind of been this ongoing narrative about how it was going to be a disaster and that Corbyn would not only lose the election but would destroy Labour. It was even, I think, a surprise for a lot of people who supported him, who kind of thought that defeat was inevitable. Well, they were defeated, but that this kind of catastrophic defeat was inevitable. So getting to actually talk about Corbynism and what that is, do you define Corbynism and the project behind him by the concrete policies that he has, like things that he's going to do, like, you know, building more homes and so on and so forth? Or do you think it's something broader than that?
I think it's both at the same time. I think if you want to understand why there's so much support for Corbyn, you do have to look at the material circumstances. There's the fact young people can't afford houses anymore. There's the fact that wages are stagnating. Wages are actually lower in real terms than they were when the Conservatives came to power. There's more and more insecure forms of unemployment. So though we've ostensibly had a recovery, we've not got the kind of jobs that we had before. If you get me, there's a lot of 0 hours contracts, a lot of fake self-employment, and all the rest of it. So I think, you know, it definitely is about material policies, and Corbyn is speaking on these issues. He's talking about higher minimum wage, he's talking about getting rid of 0 hours, he's talking about building houses, talking about rent controls recently. But I think it's also just this broader... It's the first time in a while that a politician has come along and actually said, things actually can be quite a lot better. Ed Miliband, who was obviously the last Labour leader in the 2015 election, I think he's actually said more recently he would have liked to run on a bolder manifesto. But I think there's been this idea that basically it felt like the Tories had won the argument after the financial crash, which was that it was caused by overspending, which is not true. It wasn't, it wasn't caused by government overspending. It was caused by the financial sector. But it felt like they'd won that argument. So Labour was very boxed in, and it couldn't argue for higher public spending. And if you can't argue for higher public spending, then as a sort of social democratic party faced with a Conservative party that's gutting the welfare state, that's slashing really essential public spending, that's loosening employment law as well, that's just pushing a really kind of an economically right-wing agenda. And if you feel like you can't push against that because it will make you seem economically not credible, then you can't really do anything. And for people who are struggling under the Conservative government, there was nothing on offer for them, basically. It felt like there's particularly after Ed Miliband lost, there was this mood within part of the Labour Party that we couldn't defend benefits for disabled people and that kind of thing. So I think to see a politician come along and just be like, no, actually we can do things, like it's enough of this, it's time for change, like this is failing, that sort of got people excited. So it's, I think Corbyn's style is part of it as well.
I wanted to maybe get on to talking about Corbyn's style in a minute, but just on what you're saying there, so that to some degree is a situation that is replicated in slightly different ways, but similar ways across Europe, where there's been an argument that's been won by the right, and also a common sense and inverted commas way of how to do politics, how to win support, what things you can and can't do and win an election. And what you were saying there about how he came along and said, actually, you can do things differently. This is where I get to talking about Corbynism as having like a utopian dimension. So obviously we've got these little things like £10 an hour minimum wage, which, okay, if you're talking in the grand scheme of like utopian projects and all the amazing things you can imagine, that's not a huge thing, but that is a little thing that will make people's lives better, which, even though it's a small thing, I still think of that as utopian, like concrete ways of making people's lives better. But also, do you think that it has this utopian dimension, which you've touched on there, which is this whole concept of, oh, yes, another society is possible, where we've been in an age for so long where it's like, these are the parameters of how we live. It's very nice to talk about all those other things, but we have to be realistic. And it feels like there's been this like breakthrough.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It feels like you're allowed to be a little bit more ambitious, because it's the funny thing is, very, the manifesto, the recent general election manifesto, actually it wasn't in the context of wider European politics. It wasn't like madly radical at all.
No,
it was
like
just
free tuition fees that already exists in some countries.
Right, exactly. But you feel like the conversation's been opened up, and you've got things like the Labour Alternative Models of Ownership report, which is talking about not just nationalisation, which is very popular in this country, as it turns out, to the dismay of the Tories. If you ask people they want to nationalise things, they seem to say yes a lot of the time. But also stuff like cooperative ownership, and just ways to try and achieve these kind of things. And it's just after several decades of this like private is best, we need private providers even of our public services. It just feels like the conversation's been opened up, and talking about wealth taxes, potentially talking about raising taxes, talking about stuff that could be done to like help us achieve a better society, but it felt for so long like the parameters of what you're allowed to discuss was so narrow. So even when people aren't making massively radical proposals in this kind of context, it feels radical. And trade unions as well. He's very, very strongly supportive of trade union organising. That's just starting to happen again in the UK in kind of low paid industries, because like in many countries, our trade unions remain strongest kind of in middle class public sector sort of jobs, and they're not really very strong in kind of retail, food delivery, food service, all these kind of things. But there's been some union activity there, and it does. I mean, I interviewed some McDonald's workers who were the first fast food workers to go on strike ever in the UK. And they said to me, Jeremy Corbyn makes us feel like we're supported and like we can do this because people are on our side. And, it's not just us against the entirety of the power. And a few of them said that to me independently. So I think it is this idea of, strength in numbers and redistributing power and making things fair and taking on power, taking on the establishment. That is really encouraging to people. And I guess in some ways, I feel like party politics is playing catch up with like a kind of activisty thing that's been going on basically since the financial crash. But I also think it's probably drawing a lot of people into politics who didn't really think it could do anything for them beforehand.
Well, yeah, I think that's one of the really big aspects of it. Like before, the idea of just like believing that change is possible and that we could create a better world, and saying that, you feel silly saying it almost, because people don't believe that. And I mean, me, for example, I've always been interested in politics to an extent, but like my engagement with electoral politics was basically non-existent. Like, I'd read books about like neoliberalism and stuff, but like I didn't know like any MPs beyond, I knew who the leaders of the party were, and then maybe one or two others, didn't know about. I was really cynical about. I was just not engaged. It didn't feel like anything could ever happen there. I couldn't see any significant change. And then suddenly there's this guy who I'd never heard of Jeremy Corbyn before. So just to give you an idea, like I didn't know who he was. I suddenly saw him talking about taxing the rich, which is like that's not like a massively radical thing, but in this context, hearing a politician say that, I couldn't believe it. I haven't seen that for so long, and didn't expect, talking about, as you said, talking about nationalising railways and stuff, which has always been, I think it's always been popular really, but there was no politician articulating that. Things like free tuition. I couldn't believe that I'd ever see a prospect of free tuition fees. Again, that shouldn't be a big thing, but in this context, it felt like it was. And since Jeremy Corbyn came along, I started to feel like things could happen in electoral politics. And I think that's not just my personal experience. We know from the fact that a lot of people who don't usually vote participate in the election. I believe I'm right in saying it had a higher turnout than you normally get.
Yeah. Youth turnout, I think it was around 60%, which is maybe a little bit low. I mean, I've seen different numbers reported, but kind of high 50s, and it's been low 40s before. Youth turnout, it's weird because people kind of talk about it as if it's always been like that. It actually was in the kind of mid-90s when I can't remember if it was 92. I think it dropped a bit in 92 and then dropped more in 97. And then it's pretty much been down since there. So it's not that young people have always been disengaged from politics. And I mean, we can theorise about why that is, but my own personal theory is just because for basically the period of, from Blair onwards, there did seem to be such broad consensus between all three major parties, if the Lib Dems still count as a major party. But it's not there. But so it felt like, it just felt like this unmovable sort of like, like this is the system, this is how it works, you're never going to take it on from within.
It was a real challenge to like possibility, if you see what I mean. And it feels like since then these things that have been impossible are now open for debate, and people are talking about changes to society in a way they weren't before. And I think that's a utopian act, opening up territory of possibility, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, completely. I think that's what it is. I think it goes well beyond what was in the current manifesto. Although I do think when you start talking about these things, I mean, even stuff like, say, like a maximum wage cap, like you could, like your CEO can't earn more than 20 times. That's one of those things that got mocked, or like kind of mainstream political journalists just assumed that it would, people would think it was ridiculous, and it turns out it had majority public support. Or what was the other one that?
It's not surprising, really, is it? Because most of us aren't like CEOs.
Right, exactly. But that's what's always been quite absurd about this. When you really think about, that's why it was so depressing. Like the idea that things that people like you and me probably were like, well, this should be popular, but then you just get told, no, you can't possibly say this to people. They won't vote for it. And it's just like, why vote? If you feel like, this does represent the interests of the majority. But I think the other thing as well is that this election's shown is that the newspapers don't have as much power as they think they thought they did, or also as much power as maybe they used to, because there's some research come out recently that says that if people got their news from print media, they were more likely to vote Conservative, and if they got their news online, they're more likely to vote Labour. But this holds even after you control for age. So it's not just that younger people were obviously more likely to get their news online and more likely to vote Labour. It's also, there are ways to bypass information gatekeepers now to potentially change political possibilities.
Yeah, so just quickly for people who don't know, from basically the day that Corbyn was elected leader of the party, there was massive attacks on him from pretty much every media outlet, especially obviously this in the lead up to the election. That was really strong, kind of an unprecedented level of vitriol towards him in the press, and even publications that you might think might be more sympathetic to him, like The Guardian. I won't ask you to say anything about The Guardian, given that you don't write for them sometimes, but I was personally really shocked because The Guardian, of course, they didn't attack him in the same way as like Daily Mail and stuff, which was just more bad faith and outright falsehoods. But I was really surprised with the kind of the amount that they put into their own attacks on him, and it was really surprising to me. I think kind of exposed them in some ways, and kind of I know that they wouldn't necessarily agree with all of Corbyn's policies, but they would seem to represent some of the values that people in that kind of political faction would represent. But it seemed that they don't want to follow you on those values. That was really surprising to me. Do you think that we've reached something of a tipping point now of media power? Because, as you said, it didn't really have an effect, or perhaps even had the opposite effect that they intended. And I think a lot of people were surprised that it didn't have. I thought that their attacks would be effective, particularly when we had terrorist attacks shortly before the election, and there was a big campaign in the media to try and paint Corbyn as a terrorist sympathiser, which I thought would be really have a really bad effect on his electoral performance, but it didn't seem to. So, like, have we reached the tipping point where like social media and stuff is more important?
I think maybe some of the attacks have been so sort of over the top that I wonder if it's just stopped working. Like, anyone who's convinced is already convinced, and maybe a lot of people are just tuning it out. Like, I think people do think that, the attacks have been ridiculous. I think. Do you think, sorry to interrupt you, but just to link back to something you said earlier, do you think that it might have something to do with like Corbyn's style and his kind of authenticity that makes him like immune to the kind of attacks they're trying to? I think it's like when the onslaught is so intense, and it's like, this man is evil, but at the same time he's like dangerous because he's a pacifist, and a lot of it contradicts each other, and then it's just all just like, it's all a bit over the top, and then people see him on TV and they're like, he seems quite nice and reasonable, and I think what he says makes sense. Then the picture of him they were trying to create didn't fit with how he came across at all, and I actually think his sort of ability to perform under media pressure has improved over the past 2 years. As you'd expect, he's like, he's been a politician for decades, but he's been a backbencher, not really that in the public eye, a lot more free to just do his own thing. And then suddenly he was thrust into, like, he became the leader. Like, I think even he didn't expect it when he stood in the contest, to be honest, as far as I can tell. He was understaffed. He didn't really have the training for it. So I think early on he wasn't very good at dealing with very hostile journalists and people trying to catch him out. And his team they didn't have enough staff to respond to fake stories fast enough and put them down and put quotes out. But I think over the past couple of years they've really got better at the practical side of things. And because I think a Labour leader's always going to face, most print media in the UK is Conservative supporting, and that's largely because of ownership. It's a big factor. Yeah. Our media skews more right wing than the population does, for example. But I think Corbyn had it particularly bad attack, partly just because he's a particular threat to their interests, I guess, but also because from the point of view of a political journalist, he didn't play the game right, and it wasn't just about whether he's left or right wing, although that was a part of it. It was insider versus outsider, and they just sort of assumed he'd be gone soon. So for example, Andrea Leadsom, who was a Tory leadership candidate, she's I think she's a bad politician, but I think she got treated differently to some of the other candidates because she was seen as sort of a joke.
Right, okay.
Journalists would maybe not check their stories as carefully before they put them out about her and stuff like that. So I think that's a factor. And there was also the issue that a lot of Labour MPs who were to the right of the party, the kind of centrists, they wanted him gone as well. So they were going to newspapers and briefing against him. And again, this is something that can always happen in a party. People work against each other, but it was much more kind of intense thing. But it sort of feels like now he's gone through that sort of baptism of fire, it sort of feels like what else have they got to throw at him,
Okay. Do you think that the rise of Corbyn is emblematic of a utopian moment in politics? So what I mean by that is, I've made the argument elsewhere that Trump and Brexit and Corbyn are in a way all a symptom of the same phenomenon, which is that there's a desire for change, a rejection of the way things are now. Trump's vision isn't utopian to me. The Brexit campaign's vision is not utopian to me, but I think all of these things capture a desire for change, which you could call utopian in the sense of it's the impossible becoming real. So do you think that's fair? Do you think that we're in a utopian moment?
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the word utopian, but we're certainly in a period where people want change. So I think we're in a period when a lot of people have reached the end of their tether of being told that the experts say it's impossible. The experts say this is how it has to be. We're formally a democracy, but really the options are quite limited. And I think people are going, no, screw that. And it's interesting to think about why, because obviously when we're talking about Corbyn, for example, this is very much a young people-led movement, and we can talk about, it's not exclusively, but disproportionately, and we can talk about the material reasons why young people do want change and feel like they've got less to lose because they don't feel like the current system is working for them. Whereas pensioners who own their own homes, which had kind of become, making money for them just by existing as the housing bubble grows, and who have had their benefits somewhat protected, and all the rest of it are less desiring of change because they feel like they've got something to lose. And the Trump thing's interesting because the Trump, he obviously lost the popular vote, and obviously because he's a Republican, his voters were richer on average than Clinton's voters. But the swing voters weren't. So the people who switched from Democrat to Republican were lower income people, and the people who switched from Republican to Democrat, sort of higher income people. But I guess there was a true rebellion within the Republican Party, if you get me, in the primaries.
It's a really strange sort of moment, isn't it? That it's hopeful in a way because, as we said before, there was this sense that nothing could happen, but it also feels quite dangerous when you get people like Trump emerging, who he's kind of a false avatar of change in some ways, in terms of taking on vested interests that he claims. He's clearly not going to do that.
But I think Hillary was such a symbol of the state. I mean, it's not just about Trump, because it's also Bernie Sanders, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure.
The idea of him getting as close as he did to getting the Democrat nomination is kind of crazy. Again, a very, fairly moderate social democrat. He wouldn't even be that super left in the UK. But in American context, he was proposing something quite radical. Even single payer healthcare, universal healthcare. But also he had the same style of Corbyn, the idea of like taking on elites, taking on Wall Street, taxing people. Rich people will, can afford to pay more to benefit all of us, and all the rest of it. And I think there is this mood there is this feeling amongst, I think, growing numbers of people that things are broken and it's time for radical change. And I guess it's just manifesting in pretty different ways. It's difficult. I suppose it's difficult with Brexit, because I think people voted Brexit for different reasons, and it's actually kind of quite a funny coalition of different groups. Like you've got your Jacob Rees-Mogg sorts, and you have got people like, I met some UKIP types up in Barnsley who absolutely believe that the reason they're unemployed is because of free movement.
Right, okay. You also get people who, for who it was like just a way to kick like the political establishment. I mean, it's all getting, this is around as well. We've got the political centre that has been, defined how we've lived for the last few decades is very much anti-utopian in that sense of things can't change. And I think there's a lesson to be learned here in terms of like the term realism. Clearly, realistic is an ideological term. And I think we have to be very suspicious of taking advice from anyone who's making appeals to being realistic. And it's kind of funny now how like people on the centre are kind of starting to look a bit crazy with the stuff they're talking about.
Yeah, I do think the what's realistic argument. It just. I mean, I've seen people have been trying to claim this mantle of radical centre and be like, we represent change as well. We want to shake things up. I think we've almost sort of won the argument that things need to change. Most politicians want to adopt that posture, at least superficially. I was at the Progress rally at Labour conference, which is sort of a moderate centrist group within the Labour Party, and their thing was they kept on saying, we're the real radicals. We're the real. So I think, but that's sort of encouraging in a way, because it says people see it as politically beneficial to position themselves that way. There's a public consensus for change in a very loose way. Like, I don't know about you, but it does feels like party politics is catching up. But I know, after the financial crash, when there still wasn't a public consensus that, when there seemed to be an austerity consensus, basically. And I was just like, if not now, then like, when are people going to rise up? You know what I mean? And it did feel after the 2015 election, it's like, austerity, some of the cuts are hitting fairly narrowly, but if we can't win an election now, then what the hell? Like, why are you people voting for the Conservatives?
Yeah.
But I think it does feel like everything's become so much more possible, which is terrifying in a way, because it means that we can mess up.
Yeah, but it's nice to see that the sort of neoliberal centre basically has no ideas anymore. I mean, it feels like they've completely lost their legitimacy. They've got no ideas for how to win people back, as far as I can see.
Well, yeah, you can't. They've been very, very complacent. I mean, when you have like a post-crash recovery that, when the money keeps on being funneled upwards, when rich people benefit and get richer and richer, and ordinary people's living standards stagnate or get worse, and their work gets more insecure, and their public services get cut. How are you going to convince people that that's a system worth defending? I do think specifically an issue with young people, because there's a whole conservative thing of a property owning democracy, and if you want to encourage people to vote Conservative, the best way to do that is for them to own houses, so they feel like they've got like an investment in the capitalist system. And I think it's always somewhat of a con. But when young people don't even have that, and they don't even have a job that they know they'll be able, they can feel confident they'll have in a few months, or sometimes they don't even have a job they feel confident they'll have tomorrow. Like if you're on a 0 hours contract, or you're like technically self-employed but basically not, like you're doing delivery driving or something, or you're unemployed, you've just finished studying with the hope of getting work, and you're not being able to find a job that matches your skills, and you're like, well, what have I got to lose? Like, what are you telling me I should want to conserve?
Yeah, and they lack that fear that older people have who, like you say, may not like what the Conservatives are doing, but like have a mortgage and they're a bit like young people, they don't really have anything. Like they've got no money in their bank accounts, they don't have a proper job, so like they don't have fear of change that.
Labour keeps on coming out with stuff that's appealing, like John McDonnell's thing on capping the amount of credit card interest that can accrue. I know that would benefit lots of people. I know potentially, because student debt one thing, but the kind of debt that you don't only pay back when you earn a certain amount of money and does gather interest much more rapidly, kind of negatively affects a lot of people's lives, like payday loans, credit cards, that sort of thing. And the Labour just keeps on coming out with policies that people see them like, that would make my life better. And the Conservatives seem unable to do that. They just have nothing. And even kind of Corbyn's critics within the Labour Party don't really seem to have much.
Yeah, sure. Talking of them, so you said you've been to Labour Party conference, so obviously part of the movement behind Corbyn has been a grassroots thing. So people who don't know, there's an organisation called Momentum, which is kind of runs parallel to the Labour Party, which is a grassroots organisation which has been really, really influential in getting new members into Labour and winning support for Labour. They were really successful with like getting videos and stuff shared and lead up to the election. It's been an influx of membership. Now within the actual Labour Party, the kind of institutional power, still a lot of it is held by the right. I understand that they're trying to redress that balance a bit and move power towards the membership. Is there any sense from Labour conference like how successful they've been in that or what they're doing about that?
So, I mean, successful. In terms of, for the past couple of years, you've had some parts of Labour and parts of the media attacked Momentum as this sort of fringe, hard left infiltrators, when in actual fact, when you're going to talk to these people, it's ordinary people. My mum's a Momentum member, actually. And I think that they've done enormous things for Labour. I mean, you talk about the videos. I think one of the really cool things about Momentum and about the kind of influx of young members is that people do often have these kind of skills that they're prepared to volunteer for free. I guess it makes sense, right? Like if you're a young creative, it makes sense that you're going to support Labour because you've probably not got a very stable income.
Yeah.
But so there's they've got people building apps like coding to help with canvassing, so you can take data on your phone off voters. And they've got these filmmakers making these adverts on a shoestring, and they manage to reach millions of people on social media despite spending very, very little money promoting them. And then you've got the Conservatives chucking literally millions of pounds at the same sort of things, and it doesn't have the same effect because people aren't choosing to share them organically. Yeah, Momentum did such good work during the election. They sort of organised carpools to get to transport people to marginal seats. So you'd have an army of volunteers ready to knock on the doors and convince people to vote Labour, convince people to come out. And the Conservatives just can't match that. I think I've seen information from Tory conference today. The average age of their members is 71.
Oh wow!
And they've now got less members than the Lib Dems.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's really encouraging because basically it makes me feel hopeful because it's something that you can't match with money.
Yeah.
Like, they're always going to have more money than Labour, probably going to have more money than Labour. Like, we do have the trade unions, which is helpful, but they, like big business will chuck money at the Conservatives and, they've got like most of the press barons on the side and the rest of it. But what they haven't got is an army of enthusiastic people who will go and knock on doors and talk about why they actually do support Labour and really mean it, or who will post on their own social media account about their personal reasons for voting Labour, which is far more likely to convince someone. If you see a load of your friends saying it, then some random Conservative video, or who will share their videos. So yeah, I think the idea that Momentum's not a mainstream part of the Labour Party is just. It doesn't make sense anymore. Like most of the conference delegates as well this year were on the left of the party. So the way the party's structured is there's in each constituency there's like a local party organisation, and then the members of that vote for delegates that get sent to the conference, and then they vote on things. like for the National Party, like rule changes or other issues. And basically last year, though they had a lot of new left-wing members, it wasn't really reflected at conference because they didn't really know how to navigate the party, whereas this year it wasn't like that at all. So there's like a real effort to democratise the party and make it more of like a one member, one vote sort of a situation. It's working. Like I think, after the election result as well, I think they won the moral argument but basically like the main argument from the centre was that Corbyn's not electable and, he might be promising nice things. It might sound nice, but it's not achievable.
And people won't support it, basically.
Yeah. But now the election result, now 40% of the vote, that's sort of been blown out of the water. So there's no reason for people just not to support the policies and the kind of movement that they want to support because they like the sound of it. So I think most of his critics within the party have piped down. There's a few exceptions. Chris Leslie is a very bitter MP. I think he was like shadow chancellor, and basically he thought he was going to be the next chancellor, and he would, and he's just a bit angry about that. But like largely speaking, I think the moral argument and a lot of the kind of practical things to do with like selection delegates and the rest of it, like the left basically is in control of the party now.
Okay, that's good. So how ambitious do you think Corbyn and the left more broadly should be? So for example, like his policies on or what he said in terms of like immigration and Brexit is areas where he's being criticised by some people on the left. I kind of still catching myself sometimes thinking, as much as I'd like to see a more open and like liberal immigration policy, I do sometimes think, it's difficult to win support for that. And then I remember that all the stuff that I thought was impossible, I was completely proved wrong. So do you think, how ambitious do you think we could be? And do you think we need to catch ourselves when we're thinking about what's not possible? Yeah,
I think it's reasonable criticism. I do think by taking the stance he did on Brexit, it neutralised the issue during the general election, and who knows how it would have gone if that had been a possible Tory attack line. Basically, by taking the stance they did, Labour made it not an issue. I do think Corbyn needs to be defending the rights of EU migrants and migrants generally. I actually don't disagree with his. I think a lot of the stuff Labour's saying about, for example, insisting that posted workers have the same employment rights as UK workers, which they currently don't necessarily get given. It is the right thing to be saying. This is a very very sort of heated argument, and you need to be really careful you don't kind of slip into blaming migrant workers themselves or suggesting that free movement does lose British people jobs on the whole, because it doesn't. But in industries like construction, there is a very specific issue of posted workers being brought across just to do jobs, and they don't really live here like beyond doing that job. And they're not having the same employment rights and being given the same wages and stuff as UK workers would be given. And this is a thing that happens, and the unions have been campaigning on the issue on behalf of migrant workers as well as UK national workers for a while. So I think, and I do think practically talking about these sorts of issues shows that you're taking the issue of wages seriously, but it's difficult to. You don't want to give ground to the argument that basically as long as you have free movement, that's going to be a problem in terms of wages and jobs, because it's not going to be. You can have free movement, and you can have well enforced employment rights, and you can have collective bargaining and unions setting wage rates through negotiations with employers. And if you have that, then this undercutting issue, which is far less of an issue than UKIP and people would have you believe, but not an entirely imaginary issue, you can address that without getting rid of
ceding ground to the right.
Yeah, but I do understand that when this is a line that's been pushed so long, people feel like even talking about that at all is ceding ground to the far right. It's a difficult one, because I feel like if you don't say anything, then you're. I don't know, man. But I'd like to. I feel like Labour are slowly softening their kind of Brexit position in a kind of very. It's funny for all the talk about Corbyn's not prepared to compromise, or he's not a pragmatic politician. On this issue specifically, he's being definitely, playing politics.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that it is right for people to be pushing on that. Part of me, it's difficult. I think he could be leading the conversation a little bit more. My hope is, if you can, I feel like a lot of it is about identifying the actual problem. So if you can, no, it's not because of immigration that, there's not enough houses being built, so you can't get a council house, or you can't find an affordable, even private rental place, or, it's not because of immigrants that your public services are overstretched. In fact, precisely the opposite. Our public services rely on migrant labour a lot of the time, particularly the NHS. So I feel like if you can talk about the actual problems, maybe, that's the way to try and match the stuff. But no, it's not the fault of immigration. Like, the problems you identify are real. You're being lied to about who's causing them.
I think those conversations are kind of starting to happen. Like, as we've already said, there's loads of stuff that was impossible to debate before, which is now. So hopefully that's happening. So often people try to suggest that Corbyn is representing a return to a past politics. Do you think that's true in any sense, and necessarily a bad thing? That he kind of represents politics of the past, this idea that he's reviving an old...
I think that argument rests on the idea that we'd reached the end of history, and everyone had agreed that neoliberalism was the best possible system. And that's the end of that, which is just nonsense. If you're saying that public ownership and people, council housing, and all these things that were actually quite good are outdated ideas or old-fashioned ideas, then sure. But there's a lot in the kind of Corbyn project and the kind of policy they're developing that's very new. They're looking at how to deal with platform capitalism, Uber, Amazon, and these sort of monopolies. They're looking at new ways to create cooperatives. They're looking at
energy stuff as well, I think, green.
They have a better climate offering, that they're looking at solving the problems of today. And, of course, ultimately, there are finite, broad economic models, right? You can have things privately owned, you can have things publicly owned, or you can have things cooperatively owned. And for sure, we're trying to move away from the private sector dominating everything, which is more like it was in the 70s. But, it's the solution to the problem now. Carrying on as things are isn't the solution to the current situation. Kind of free market capitalism has created problems. Or we had stronger trade unions, and people had...
Yeah. If affordable housing is old-fashioned, then fine, I'll have old-fashioned.
Yeah, there were things that were good in the past, and there were things that were bad. Let's keep the things that are good from the recent history.
I think, as you suggested as well, it's not just rolling back, because we have the problems we have today are different, and there may be kind of broad ideological ideas, but the different solutions that are being applied, there's different problems and different contexts.
Well, just we're talking about automation and what that might mean, and and even the possibility of a universal basic income, which I'm somewhat on the fence about. But the idea that these are just old-fashioned ideas being rehashed, it's just not true. And the idea that it's an argument that rests on the premise that any movement away from neoliberalism and free market capitalism is bad, and I think making that kind of argument post 2008 is a bit questionable.
Yeah. Okay. One final question. Do you have any concerns that the resurgence of the left that we've seen in the UK and the movement behind Corbyn is too tied up in Corbyn himself? If everything was to go horribly wrong with him for some reason, whatever that would be, do you think this is a movement that would endure, or do you think that would be a big blow?
He is very much the figurehead, but I think he would endure. I think there's support for other figures within Labour, but I think beyond that, there's support for the ideas. It's difficult to know. He is very, very much the figurehead of what's going on, but I don't think that, say, he, God forbid something happened to him, and then there needed to be a new leader earlier than planned, that all the people who support him would just give up on the things he represents. So I think it is ultimately, it can, I think, to people who aren't really on board, it can look a little bit personality cultish. But it's not actually about, him so much as what he represents, which is the possibility of change, the possibility of something better, like the promise things actually can get better. You actually can earn enough to live on. You actually do have the right to affordable housing. Like, society can get better. We can fix these problems. We don't just have to accept this kind of gradual managed decline that the Conservatives have been telling us we have to put up with. Yeah, I think can sustain beyond him, but I also think there are reasons to be thinking about how to strengthen and broaden it even now.
Yeah, I suppose the hope that I'd have on that is it has started as like a grassroots thing rather than something that's been imposed from above, which I think gives it a stronger base. And also, I suppose the other positive in that regard is with the polls, I seem to remember that it was when they released the manifesto, it was like one of the massive turning points, which, as you say, is about, that's the ideas. And that was the thing that seemed to swing support towards him. So I think that's positive in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Abi.
Cheers for having me on.
So that's the end of my conversation with Abi. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much to Abi for coming on. You should go and follow her on Twitter at Abi Wilks. As I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, if you could take a moment to give me a rating or review on iTunes, whatever you use to listen to this, that would be hugely appreciated and would be a massive help. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons, should you feel able and compelled to support the podcast financially. For anyone who don't know, this is a thing where you can give like a certain amount of money, like however much you like a month, to support the podcast. And it's a thing you can cancel at any time. So if you just want to do like a one-off donation type thing, then you can do that. As I mentioned before, all I was really trying to do in this early stage is cover the hosting costs of the podcast, which is €9 a month. So it's not very much, just to, make the podcast not cost me money, which would be good. But it's something that, would be good to grow. And, obviously a lot of Patreons, they do particular rewards and stuff for different pay levels. So if you've got ideas of stuff that you think would work or you would want from a Patreon subscription, then email me utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com, tweet me at Utopian Horizons and let me know. And yeah, I'm open to implementing those ideas and coming up with ways of making it better. If you've got any feedback on the episode, any questions, any points you'd like to raise that I could address in the next one or whatever, again, tweet me at Utopian Horizons on Twitter, email me utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com. It would be great to hear from you, hear what you think. In terms of new episodes coming, I've got a couple of things arranged, so they'll hopefully be coming fairly soon. As I mentioned, I'm going to be trying the Philip K. Dick thing as well, so Time Out of Joint will be the next one. I need to get some more film episodes up as well. That's something I keep saying I want to do, and I do want to do that, and I am going to try and do that. Finding it hard to sort of think of people that would be good to have on or find people, because I don't really know film that well. Sean McTiernan, if you're listening, I think he listens to the podcast. I don't know if he listens to every episode. He came on for episode we did on Kamikaze 89, which was really good, so check that out. If you're listening, you know film, maybe you know some people that would be good for me to have on, so yeah, please let me know if you can think of someone that might be good to have on for this. Sean does a really good podcast called All Units, which is Anatomy of the Thriller, which I recommend you checking out. Yeah, so that's it. I've got an interview or two arranged. There'll be the Philip K. Dick stuff coming, and I will try and get some more film stuff soon. Thanks for listening.